Hello and welcome to our lesson on CSS Flexbox, the second lesson in our CSS layout videos. So CSS Flexbox is a layout tool that we use to manipulate things in a one-dimensional way. So we use CSS Grid to manipulate things in a two-dimensional way so we can control things in columns and rows as well. In Flexbox we're controlling things more one-dimensionally, so only inside of their container. So let's get started and see how this works out. So to get a basic setup, we're going to get our classic HTML setup. Notice that we have two style sheets here. We have a layout style sheet as well as just a style sheet. The layout is where you're going to put your flexbox or grid material, and style is where you're going to put any sort of UI material, things like colors or borders, background colors, things of that nature. Notice that we have a div with the class container again. So much in the same way that we declare grid, we are going to be declaring flexbox the same way. So we have to give the container a display of flex, as you'll see in the CSS at the bottom. Similar to grid, we have a flex container, and inside of the flex container we have flex items. So we've declared that our container, our div with the class container, is displayed flex. So in this case, that's the flex container, and now any direct child of that container is going to be a flex item. So flex items are what we're actually manipulating inside of the flex container with these flex rules. So anything that is a direct child of that div with the class of container is going to be a flex item, and thus subject to any of the flex rules that we put inside of that container. So the two biggest things that we need to talk about inside of Flexbox before we keep moving are the axes. We're talking about axes like a graph, like the X and Y axis, not these. So we have two axes. The first is the main axis. The main axis is by default your horizontal axis, so it's going from left to right. So we're going to be talking about things being placed on the main axis. We're going to be talking about horizontal placement. And then we're talking about the cross axis is going to be our vertical axis. So whenever we're talking about placing things on the cross axis, it's going to be your Y or vertical axis. So these are subject to change, and we'll discuss that when it becomes relevant, but by default your main axis is horizontal, your cross axis is vertical. So the first thing that we need to do to be able to really see what we're doing with our Flexbox code is to add some flex items inside of our flex container. So you'll notice that there are 5 new items here inside of our container. So this is housed just inside of our HTML document. And we have some new CSS style rules. So you'll notice inside of the container class we still have a display of flex, and we're going to do some similar stuff that we're used to when it comes to just setting up a container for all of our code. We're giving it a margin of 2 rems on the top and bottom and auto on the left and right, so this is going to give us some space on the top and bottom and then center our container. We're also going to give some padding to the container as well. This is just so our flex items aren't actually touching the edges of our container, and we're just setting a max width to 1,000 pixels. So this should all be familiar to you. This is just setting up a basic container structure so that we essentially just have something that's a little nicer to look at and a little easier to kind of take in. The next thing that you'll notice is that each of these classes has the class of flex item as well as a flex item specific to which item they are. We are adding some styles to the actual flex item class. So in this case, we're giving a margin left of 5 pixels to anything with a flex item, so which would be any of these, and a padding of 11. Again, so we're just going to put some space between the actual text content and the box itself that it's inside of. And then with the first child of the flex item, we're going to take that margin away. So what this is going to do is essentially give everything a left margin of 5 pixels except for the first thing. So we're essentially just giving some space to the elements inside of the container, but we're not adding extra margin to the first item. We're just going to let that sit as it is. So moving on. So you'll notice that what we have here is the result of the CSS styles that we looked at on the previous slide. The next thing that we're going to talk about are the two ways that you can actually use flex rules inside of a container. So you can declare either display flex the way that we have currently, or we have inline flex. So flex is going to treat the container as a block level element and then still allow the flex rules to be declared inside of it. And that's what you see here. In the next slide, we're going to be seeing actually inline flex. So what inline flex does is it gives you the same ability to use the flex rules that you can use when you define display flex. But this inline flex actually treats your container as an inline element. So you'll notice that none of those margin styles that we applied to the container matter anymore. It's just being treated as an inline element and being pushed all the way to the left. And this is because it's now inline as opposed to block. So this is really useful when you want to still use flex rules but treat your container as an inline item. So keep in mind that there's display flex, and that's going to treat your container as a block level element, and inline flex, which is going to treat your container as an inline level element. You still have the same flex rule capability with each one. It's just how the actual container is displayed. So the next thing we're going to move on to is flex direction. So this is one of the first really cool things about Flexbox. You actually get to manipulate your content without having to use any weird styles like floats or anything like that. So flex direction is the first of these. So let's check this out and see it in action. So this is what we're currently looking at, and as is the truth with every CSS value, everything has a default value. So the default value of flex direction is row, and that's what you're seeing currently. So all of the items are lined up left to right, and they're at the left of the container. So this is our default flex direction row. So let's see a couple of the other options that we have. The first of which is row reverse. So row reverse is pretty intuitive. It's going to do what I would assume that you're thinking. It's going to just reverse our content, so it's still displayed in a row, but what we're doing is we're starting at the right end of the container and placing our elements backwards. So you can see we start with flex item 1 on the right here, and then we go to the right and place the rest of these items. This is really useful. It's only one line of code, and you can change the whole direction of your content. The next really useful one is flex direction column. So instead of a row of items, we're actually going to see a column. So you'll notice we start at the top and we go item 1, 2, 3, etc. And again, this is really helpful. This is one line change in your CSS, and we now have a totally different layout style. And then finally we have column reverse, which is going to do something very similar to row reverse, except we're going to keep our aspect in a column, and we're just going to reverse the flow of our content. So instead of starting from the top, we're going to start from the bottom of the container, still in a column perspective. We're going to start with item 1, 2, 3 from the bottom all the way up. So you can see already that you have a pretty versatile way to organize your content inside of a container with Flexbox. So the next thing we're going to talk about is flex wrap. So what you'll see a lot of times with responsive design is having to prepare your viewport for smaller widths. So in this case, Flexbox is really handy. So what we can see right now is if we compress our window currently with the current style rules we have, notice how all of the flex items just kind of squish together. They kind of take the lowest possible width that they can and still contain their actual content. So what flex wrap does though is allows your content to actually flow onto another line or column depending on your flex direction. So notice the way that we declare flex wrap. So there's a flex wrap property, and we're just going to give it the wrap value. There's also a no wrap value, which is no dash wrap, and that's actually the default value. That's what we're seeing with this behavior here. So when we declare flex wrap, let's see what we get. So notice now all of our content maintains its same width. It's not breaking this text onto different lines to make sure that these things fit. It's just going to break each of these pieces of content onto the next line when the viewport doesn't allow for them to remain on the same line. And notice here we have no wrap and wrap reverse. Wrap reverse obviously is going to act very similarly to row reverse and column reverse. It's just going to wrap things in a reverse order. So you would see these elements 4 and 5 wrapping above 1, 2, and 3 as opposed to below them if we did wrap reverse. So the next property that we're going to talk about in flexbox is order. So notice in the example here we have an order that we're placing on an individual item. So order is not something that you're going to be placing on the container. This is something that you're going to be placing on flex items individually. So again, the default value that we have for order on each of these flex items is 0. The way that order works is that it is going to order your flex items based on the relative number that they have as far as order. So if we have a default value of 0 on all flex items as they stand right now, and we give flex item 4 an order value of -1, since this is lower than 0, it's going to come before everything else. And we can see that in action here in the next slide. So notice now how the order has been altered. So now that flex item 4 has an order value of -1, it's going to be at the beginning of our container here. And then we have the same order that we started with, and this is all just based on how these things appear in your DOM. So we have flex item 1, 2, 3, and then 5, with 4 starting because we changed the order value. So moving on to justify content, and this is where we really get to see the power of flexbox. So justify content is going to handle the organization of your content on your main axis. So by default, this is going to handle the layout on the horizontal axis inside of whatever container you have declared flex. So as we can see, this is what we have to start. And this is the default value of justify content, which is flex start. So you'll see that all of our content starts at the very left of this container and flows to the right. So next, the next value that we have to look at inside of justify content is flex end. So flex end acts very similar. So instead of starting at the left, though, we're going to start at the right. Notice the difference here between row reverse and flex end. So we still have the same order. We're starting from the left and going right at item 1, item 2, item 3, 4, 5. But we actually have everything sort of floated to the right here, and that's what flex end is doing for us. So this is really valuable when you want your content to be over toward the right. This could be really valuable for, say, like a navigation bar or something like that. But you want your order to still remain the way that you dictated inside of your DOM. The next value that we have for justify content, and this is a really helpful one, is center. Because before Flexbox and Grid, we didn't really have easy ways to center most pieces of content. But notice all we have to do is change one line of CSS here, and we have centered content. Notice the same layout, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but everything's in the center. So it's taking all of this empty space that we have and just applying it to either side. Similar to how we have when we have margin auto, it just splits this area up between whatever the content is. The big difference being here that we're doing this with 5 items all in one container. So we're essentially applying a margin of auto to all of these elements as one thing, but we don't have to put them inside of their own div or anything like that. We just get this really powerful layout tool from Flexbox to be able to just center these things with just one line of CSS code. So another really cool value with flexbox is space between. So if we give our justify content space between, that's going to take all the extra space that we had and it's going to apply it evenly between each of these items. And that ends up being really helpful with a lot of layout tools. I'm sure you can find a lot of application with that. So yeah, space between, keeping things in between all of these elements. And another really useful value for justify content, space around. So similar to space between, we're going to be equally distributing the extra space that we have inside of our container onto each of the elements inside. What we're going to do is place that space around each element. So we have an equal amount of space on this side of this element and this side of this element, and that's going to happen on each of these elements. So, so this is really nice when you want to have even distribution of your content inside of a container, but you don't want your elements actually touching the edges of your container. You can use space around instead of space between for that. So just a recap of what we have as far as options inside of justify content. Note that you can't use these OR pipes that we have in here. These are just to show you that these are all options inside of justify content. You can only use one of these at a time. So we have flex start, which keeps your content at the to the left of your container. Flex end, which will keep it to the right of your container. Center, which will center all of your content inside of its container. Space between, which will evenly distribute whatever remaining space there is in between each of your elements. And then space around, which will evenly distribute all of the space around each of your elements. So moving on now to align items. So align items acts very similar to justify content, except this is handling the distribution of your flex items on the cross axis, which again by default is the vertical or Y axis. So to see this in action, we're going to add some height. Notice here we're adding some height to our container, just of 20 rems, so we can actually see what align items is doing. And again, noting the default values of every CSS rule, the default value of align items is stretch. So let's see what we get with the default value of stretch. So as you might have guessed, when we have just the default value stretch here, our items are taking up the full height of the container that they're inside of. It's important to keep in mind that all of these things have default values because this can get really tricky when you're dealing with things like images, for example. So align items has a tendency to distort images really easily because of this default feature. So it'll actually just stretch whatever that element is from top to bottom. So you need to make sure to pay attention to that whenever you're working with images, for example. You're going to want to make sure that you change that default value so that you're not getting this behavior. You're getting the actual behavior that you want. So moving on from the default value of align items, we're going to move to the first and very familiar value of flex start. So the value of flex start does a very similar thing inside of align items that it does inside of justify content. It's just going to put your items at the top or the beginning of your container. So in this case now we have still justify content of space between on all of these items, and then we have align items flex start, so everything's just at the top of the container now. Moving on to the next value, we also have a flex end inside of align items. Does the same thing that it does inside of justify content, just moves things to the end of the container. So since this is the Y axis, it's going to be on the bottom as opposed to the top. And this is where things get really, really powerful inside of Flexbox. So align items also has a center value, which is really awesome because this is going to allow us to center items both vertically and horizontally inside of a container with only 2 lines of CSS code, just changing the align value to center and the justify content values to center. So This is really great because CSS layouts used to be nightmares. I mean, before we had flexbox, this was a much, much harder task to do. There was all orders of math that you had to do to figure out how much padding you needed or margin you needed inside of a container. You had to know the exact values of your container, what the height was, what the width was, to be able to center things vertically. All we need in Flexbox is an align items rule with the value of center, and we now have vertical alignment. So this is really, really powerful, and we're going to see now an example of just centering things on align items and justify content. So that's it. So that's all we had to change. Notice all we have in here, the only things that are really affecting this right now are the display of flex, align items center, justify content center, and with those rules, we get perfectly centered content inside of our container, which is just a breeze. And I mean, this is really, really important stuff. So make sure that you keep this in mind whenever you need to center something inside of a container, either vertically, horizontally, or both. Flexbox is absolutely your best friend for this. There is no need to use any other means of doing this. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about is align self. So align self works very similar to align items, except it's a rule that we're placing on flex items as opposed to the flex container. So align self is going to have all the same values that align items did, except we're going to be placing it on each individual flex item. So this is really powerful because it lets you individually place items on your cross axis, as opposed to having to have everything placed. Maybe you have one item that is at flex end while everything else is at flex start. There's really no there's no boundaries on how you can set these things up now. So you can have everything have a different align self value, and it's gonna so let's see this in action. So notice that we're giving flex item 2 the align self value of stretch. So notice everything else still has the align items value of center. So everything else is centered. But flex item 2 now has the align self value of stretch. So it's going from the top to the bottom of this container now, which is pretty cool. There are a lot of really practical applications for this when when you're dealing with different levels of content. So you don't have to be confined to just having everything be on the same the same plane. You can move things around independently of each other. So this is really cool. One really cool property that we have inside of Flexbox is Flex Grow. So Flex Grow is going to act very similar to your FR units inside of Grid. It's going to relatively place your content depending on how much space is inside of your container and how much space is being taken up by the content of each of your flex items. So notice that we're giving everything with the class of flex item, which is each of our flex items. We're giving it the Flex Grow property, and we're setting it to 1. So notice we're not giving this any sort of like unit value. There's no pixels or M's or rems or anything like that. This is just a relative unit. So we're giving everything the flex grow of 1 right now, and we're going to see what happens if we give individual items different flex grow properties. But for now, just keep in mind that you don't have to put pixels or M's or rems or percents or anything like that on here. It's just a number value. So let's see what happens when we give everything the flex grow of 1. Now notice on your main axis, everything is now, all this extra space that we had is being split between each of these items. So all this extra space is now being applied to each of these items. So we're starting at the beginning of this container all the way to the end, and all of our content is taking up that whole space. Note that we still have the margins in between here, so those are being taken into account when we're placing extra space inside of each of these elements. So we're going to change the flex grow property of item 3 and see how that's affected. So we're going to change this to 5. So everything has a flex grow of 1 as opposed to item 3, which now has a flex grow of 5. So let's see what we get when we give item 3 the flex grow of 5. So notice now there is less of this extra space inside of the other 4 elements, and there is 5 times as much inside of flex item 3. So just to clarify that, what the extra space this flex grow property is referring to is the actual extra space. So this is only the space that's not being taken up by the content of the item, the margins between each of the items, any padding that you have, that's all being applied explicitly. Your flex grow property is using implicit values, so it's just using any space that hasn't been explicitly defined as taken up, and it's splitting it between each of your items. So notice you have this extra space here on flex item 1. You have 5 times that amount of space inside of flex item 3. So another really important value inside of flexbox is flex basis. So what flex basis does is set the minimum width of whatever your flex item is going to be. So this is essentially saying my flex element is going to be, 200 pixels wide. If you apply like a flex grow property to it, it can grow bigger than that, but it can never be any smaller than whatever I set my flex basis to. So we're going to see that in action by setting the flex basis value of flex item 4 to 350 pixels. So you'll notice we have the full screen example here, and we have flex item 4 taking up 350 pixels. Notice when we compress the screen, there's no more extra space inside of these other elements here, but flex item 4 is still going to be 350 pixels wide. So flex basis allows you to use explicit values inside of your flex items, but also use relative units as well. So this is giving you a lot of power to kind of dictate how each individual piece of content inside of a flex container is going to work. So they can all work relative to each other, but they can also be very explicit as well. So this is a really powerful tool for layout. It's a really powerful tool for organization. Hopefully you can see the value there and apply this to your own work. So now is time for some practice. So we're going to clone this repository here. So let's check that out. So we have our Flexbox practice exercise, and you're going to be following the Columbus cohort directions here. So we're going to hit the clone or download as we're so used to at this point. Click this copy to clipboard button, and then we're going to open up our Git bash. Bump that up. And we are going to make sure that we're inside of our wcci/code folder, and then we're going to get clone, and then remember it's Control-Shift-V to paste inside of Git bash. Enter. And then we can navigate to our Flexbox practice exercise. And then once we're inside of wcci/code/Flexbox practice exercise, we can go ahead and hit that subl space dot command to open this directory inside of Sublime. So notice inside of Sublime, we have our Flexbox exercise. So we have some HTML already built out here for you to work with. And inside of the CSS, we have a style .css sheet. This is just style. You don't need to mess with this at all. This is just to kind of give some style to your actual page. The challenge itself actually is going to be inside of layout. So notice that we have some layout stuff already set out for you here, and this is all grid stuff to lay out your page. The Flexbox challenge itself is down here, and you are going to be completing each one of these challenges inside of the comments. So good luck with that, and when you finish up with that practice, another really good resource that we have here is this link here to Flexbox Zombies. This is a free resource So go ahead and click this link. And notice that we have Flexbox Zombies, $225 value for absolutely free. So go ahead and click in here. And this is going to prompt you to make an account for this. Absolutely worth it. You should absolutely be making an account for this and going through Flexbox Zombies. It's an incredibly powerful tool for learning Flexbox. It's incredibly resourceful. And other resources that we have for Flexbox are the Ultimate Guide to Flexbox Learning Through Examples and the Complete Guide to Flexbox here. So once you finish up with the practice exercise, make sure to head over to Flexbox Zombies. You're not going to get that done in one day, so be sure to kind of block out some time each day to learn a little bit more about Flexbox. And then move on to these other resources that we have. So nice job, good luck with the practice, and see you in the next video.